Hi everyone and welcome to my Pulverize guide for Season 4. In the mid-season update, Pulverize Druids in particular have received a massive buff, probably the biggest buff out of all builds in the game, and it has now been elevated to be kind of on par with some of the other Druid builds. Now Druid as a whole is not like the craziest class out there right now, but they do have a bunch of really powerful builds that are all fairly balanced among themselves. So there's Wind Shear, there is Landslide, there's Lightning Storm, there's Hurricane, and now there is Pulverize as well. So that kind of fits right in there and it's a blast to play. Personally, I really like Pulverize. I've played this quite a lot back in Season 2, for example. And I went back and prepared a Pulverize Druid for this setup. What you can see me here doing is just like literally blasting through those tier 100s. Now that's not like the highest bar anymore after the pit nerfs. However, it is a very solid farming setup. You can definitely do like 3-minute clears consistently on that tier, and my character is not perfect, so I have not even masterworked everything to perfection. This was something I put together in basically a few hours, like after I read the patch notes, so to say. And yeah, I have okay gear, and I've been experimenting a little bit with what I can do. So this can definitely get a bit better, especially on softcore if you want to try to go a little bit more YOLO with your setup and have less defensive choices, for example. I did feel actually quite tanky in the setup that I made here, but again, I'm playing hardcore, so I rather want to be on the safe side. So I have heard that there's actually almost 130 clear of this already from someone who has been like a Pulverize enthusiast all season, so it can definitely push pretty high, and as I said, similar to some of the other Druid builds. And the good thing about this build is also you don't need any Uber Uniques. I was running actually 2 Uber Uniques in the setup, but both of them are not necessarily like required, I would say. Like I have the Harlequin Crest. That is just like a kind of like decent, mostly defensive upgrade actually, because the alternative there is Goldslayer Crown, which technically can be even a better DPS choice actually, but you have less defense. And then we had Tyrael's Might. You can see the bolts there coming out. This is also a slightly better version of Insatiable Fury, which is a very easy to acquire unique. So you can actually make the setup work just fine with pretty basic gear, having pretty basic uniques, and it works and it just feels amazing. What's also cool about this build is you can actually reach 100% crit chance, so that you always get those yellow numbers, you always get a nice crit multiplier. And then whenever you have the guaranteed overpowers that happen from your Pulverize and from your passives, you get these nice big orange hits, and they can be pretty large. So if you look at this here, for example, it's just one of those clips. I have seen many times similar numbers, but here, this was, for example, me trying out the build when I put it together, and we just kind of like one-tap the boss here from 50% life. It was like a 500 million hit, for example. Well, both numbers together, the Shockwave and the original Pulverize. And it is definitely possible to boost this all the way to like a double that, I'd say, like 1 billion plus is quite realistic if you really try. Now there is a bit of inconsistency here because you have to get the overpowers, and this is where most of your damage comes from. Or rather, this is where most of the burst comes from at least. So you have these guaranteed overpower triggers, and whenever that happens, you have pretty massive bonuses thanks to some of your passives. For example, the User Strength passive here gives you extra damage and even more overpower damage. And then you have a lot of life. So in my setup, I was running like 80k life or so with all the buffs up, because you get some here. You also get some from the freshly buffed Mending passive. You get some from Iron Feather. Then you can also pop a Fortitude Elixir, for example, because there's not really many other good offensive potions anyway for this build. And well, suddenly you have a lot of life, you get a lot of overpower damage. So whenever you don't overpower, you actually lose out on a lot of this additive damage and some of those synergies, and the damage will be much lower. But I calculated that roughly half of your total damage output over a 12-second period comes from the 2 guaranteed overpowers, one being from Provocation and one being from the Enhanced Pulverize. They both have a 12-second timer, so you basically get like back-to-back guaranteed overpowers from those 2 effects. And then you have like, let's say, another 10 to 15 attacks in between that are not overpowering, and those roughly contribute half of your DPS as well. Which also means that, for example, when you're in like a dangerous boss fight, you can actually more rely on those guaranteed overpowers and just, walk around, dodge around, and they will slowly stack up those effects because they are like just passive triggers to get to the guaranteed overpowers. So you actually don't lose much damage compared to, for example, other builds where, if you can't DPS, you lose all of your damage. But here you actually retain a lot of your damage while walking around and while going to the next pack, and then you have like a big burst burst him down, and then you walk again, and you get a guaranteed overpower again. And there's other overpower triggers, for example, Obsidian Slam here that was buffed. Especially for AoE clear, this is a very powerful tool because you can just like walk from pack to pack, get one overpower, kill 10 targets, get another overpower, kill 10 targets, and so on. So you can just like walk through the packs, one-shot them. And if you choose the right farming tier, this is extremely powerful combo. And this means that if you are actually pushing with this, you're gonna feel the impact of, you know, like the higher HP monsters more than some other builds, for example. It's kind of hard to really go to very high tiers. But as I mentioned, we have like confirmed 125 plus clears already or so of Pulverize, and will probably slowly creep up a little bit more over the season. So that is still pretty solid, I'd say. But especially for farming, this is a very nice setup because you get those guaranteed overpowers all the time, either from Obsidian Slam or those two other triggers. Now, there are ways to get more guaranteed overpowers that people might be asking about. For example, Banished Lord's Talisman. I just don't think it can beat a normal amulet. You have really powerful aspects on this build, and you have very few slots for them, and you can have really powerful like passives as well, like here for example Venom that can go on your neck now. You can get a lot of ranks with that, and Venom that is very good because you want to poison up enemies, and basically any non-dot Druid build runs in Venom. It's just so good, and you want to have that. It's like the best passive in the entire game. So Banished Lord's Talisman doesn't make too much sense. There's also another aspect called the Blood Boiling aspect, where you can get a guaranteed overpower every 20 seconds. But it just doesn't really match like this whole setup. You just have, it's too long of a timer basically for it to really matter. So we rather want to have other powers here. In this planner, I also have two different versions. I explained this at the start. We have Harlequin and Terrorist Might, and here's a normal setup with just Godslayer and Insatiable Fury. So that those are perfectly acceptable. So you just mostly lose out here on the Harlequin on the defensive side a little bit, but as I mentioned, you have a lot of life. It is actually a fairly tanky setup, and depending on, you know, how good your gear is, how much life you have, you can actually make some small adjustments on the skill tree as well to try to squeeze out a bit more damage if you really want to. I went for like a more tanky version here, but there are certain ways to just like, you know, swap out some things. You can also, for example, go for the buffed Scythe Talons, 10% crit chance instead of 20% life, or something like that if you want to try to hit a 100% crit rate that way, for example. So there's various things. You can also get, for example, here the movement speed from, instead of the wariness here from the first Spirit Boon. So a few little things like that, basically. But overall, I think I have a pretty solid setup here that is mostly optimized towards boss damage, because this is the main weakness that the Pulverized Druid has. So I try to mitigate that as much as possible. So one way that we're doing that is by including Petrify and Petrify Duration in the setup as well. So we have this here. This is a pretty powerful ultimate, actually one of the best ultimates in the game, I would say. So normally you get 50% extra crit damage for 7 seconds against bosses. And you have the cool part as well, it reduces its base cooldown by 10 seconds when you hit a boss. So basically you have 50 seconds and then it goes to 40 seconds. However, if you have a cooldown reduction on your setup, then you first reduce the 50 seconds by X amount. Let's say hypothetically have 50% CDR, this will be 25 seconds. And then after that you get a flat 10 seconds cut off. So the actual cooldown is actually just 15. So basically stacking cooldown reduction makes it really valuable. And if you manage to get that, or if you happen to have that at least, then this is actually very powerful for this. And there are ways to get nearly permanent or even permanent Petrify Duration on a boss if you really want to. I don't think this is necessarily required to take down a boss fast, but it is an option because we have Petrify Duration and you can get a lot of it here. So on the weapon, for example, this is the Weapon Temper. With just one master crit, you can get up to 170% extra duration. So when you have those 7 seconds, this is going to be almost 19 seconds with a roll like this of your Petrify. And well, as I mentioned, with a bit of cooldown, you can actually get to the point where you have this like nearly the entire boss fight, or maybe most of the boss fight at least, if you time it a little bit. Maybe you want to stagger the boss, for example, and then you just have this massive damage buff. Another thing that I included here is also Shebolt's Will. So this is what I think is actually a really nice tool to solve the resource issues. This is also how I played it back in Season 2, when we had the vampiric powers. And well, how do you trigger Unstoppable? With the vampiric powers. So we have Metamorphosis on the boots. If you have a good roll, then your evade cooldown goes to 10 seconds baseline. With a bit of cooldown, for example, from the Shaco, there's this actually around 9 seconds. So this needs like roughly 5 attacks or so to refresh your evade cooldown, with attacks reduce evade cooldown implicit on the boots. So this makes it fairly easy to reset that. And you can have a Shebolt's Will trigger roughly every 3-4 seconds or so, giving you lots of resources and giving you this 20% damage buff On top of this, there's not really any defensive powers really that fit into this Druid. Like, I've been checking the the list, and there's just like nothing that I want to put here. So having those unique armor items is actually recommended, I would say, and this really helps out with the resources. On top of this, I have 1 spirit per second roll just to smooth out the regeneration. I was actually trying this without those boots and just having normal boots with no spirit. That also works, but it felt a bit more uncomfortable because you have to pay a lot more attention to your Tibbot's Will. So having this 1 roll and the Tibbot's Will kind of just solved everything for me. And then, for example, on the rings, we have like a resource generation roll like this, or maybe a resource reduction roll. You can temper these things. But if you feel very comfortable on the resources, I mentioned the cooldown on Petrify. So there is a temper that you can acquire from Necromancers, which is ultimate cooldown reduction. So if you have a Necromancer and you have this recipe, then you could also put this on your rings, and this would help you with the Petrify uptime. And if you actually have 2 or 3 of those tempers and you still feel comfortable on the resources, then you could have a very short Petrify cooldown to the point where you have it basically permanently. Originally, I was also experimenting with the newly buffed Starter Skies. I was kind of motivated because they got buffed in the patch, but I realized it's actually not required. I neither need the resources, nor do I feel like I really benefit from the offensive side of it, because we actually have very powerful offensive aspect options here. So for example, I replaced the retaliation ring here with a Starter Skies. Starter Skies now goes to 50% damage bonus, but only after stacking it up 5 times. And the first 4 attacks, or the first 5 attacks, will just do less damage than that. So it takes a while to even get there, and I didn't really require the resources, and the stats were just inferior to a normal ring. So I did the math, and it turns out that a normal ring like this, with a bit of willpower extra and a bit of crit extra, and then a chance to make vulnerable, is just kind of like a plus-minus same damage option as Starter Skies. You do have the downside that you don't have as much all res. However, this is where the Tears Might really came in, because it actually has extra all res. So I was trying to find a way to, procure extra res in order to make up for the loss of Starter Skies, and this is how I did it in the end. And that was a really cool combo. But you could run a Starter Skies, it was definitely working fine if you have that. This solves some of your res issues, it solves your resource issues very nicely as well. So you don't have to worry about Tibbot's Will activation that much, for example, so if you really don't want to metamorph that much. But it doesn't really feel like a downside to use Metamorph. It's just that sometimes Metamorphosis has this weird little bug where you Metamorph and then you stand still for like half a second or 1 second or so. That happens sometimes, I'm not sure how to avoid it. So there's just a bug with this effect. But overall, it doesn't happen too often, and it didn't really put me into danger really often either. So I went with this setup here, and some of the other aspects that we have are Use on Horror. This makes our Pulverize and Earth skill, so we can start synergizing with a lot of Paragon nodes. There's also skill tree nodes that go with that. This is very good. Otherwise, this Tectonic stuff here doesn't really do anything. We have Changeling stat on the neck. This is an 83% damage when you are as a werebear and hit poisoned enemies. So you have a kind of like large swing in the damage based on poisoning enemies or not. And the main way to do that, or basically the only way to do that, is with your Poison Creeper. So this is a Shepherd's build. We have Shepherds here. So you want to have all 3 companions. And then we have Poison Creeper that you actually use. The other 2 companions you don't really press like ever. They don't really do anything. The main reason to press any of them sometimes is in order to transform back to human form, because sometimes you stay in bear for too long before your quick shift buff to drop. So this lasts 8 seconds, and you want to make sure that it keeps up. And occasionally you might just be pulverizing all the time without pressing anything else, and your Blood Howl, for example, is not ready. In that case, you can press a Ravens, you can press a Wolves, and then you transform back to human, and then you can get your quick shift buff refreshed. So this is kind of like a little optimization you can do. Or you can also just say hello. So this is something you might have seen from like a little clip of mine. But if you say hello with the emote wheel, then you also transform back to human form. So you don't necessarily have to press the companions, and then you can get the quick shift buff as well. So that's a little trick you can use. But either way, this is how that works. So I'm going to try to keep it up with either pressing Blood Howl, especially while killing enemies. You refresh the cooldown. You just kind of like press it every so often, every pack or so. And then you start pulverizing again, and you spend most of your time in bear form. And this is where Changing Set comes in with the 83% damage buff. And you have to make sure that you poison enemies with your Poison Creeper. So most of the time I just kind of like walk into a pack when there's elites, for example. I press Poison Creeper, I get this effect, I get the Envenom, I get, there's also Heightened Malice, for example, here on the tree. So we have this as well. These are a lot of really powerful damage multipliers that activate once you poison enemies and once you have multiple of them active. And this is also why you see such a wide swing in your damage, because you have the Heightened Malice, we have the Changelings, we have an Envenom, that could be something like this here. And you can see that just poisoning enemies can give you up to like times 5 or so of your damage. It's a really large multiply, so you want to make sure you have this up. On a single target, usually Poison Creeper takes care of it kind of passively, but I still press it because there is a bit of a gap. Poison Creeper dot lasts 7 seconds. It activates every 8 seconds, I think. Or no, the reverse. It's 6 seconds duration, 7 seconds cooldown. So there's this 1 second gap on a single target where the Poison Creeper will just kind of chill. And this is also where sometimes I just press Poison Creeper to make sure that, you know, whenever my guaranteed overpowers are coming up, I do have this buff, and then I go kapow. But you can definitely see a range of, like a really large range in your damage. So you see here, this is kind of like one of the bigger hits that I have done. I have done many similar hits, but I've also done many overpowers that were only like 20 million, 50 million, 80 million, or something like that, depending on if it's a shockwave or a normal hit. Shockwave does triple the damage. So you have like these kind of like large numbers and really large swings. Speaking of shockwave, so this goes on our stuff. This is the most powerful aspect in this build. It does 200% of the base damage as the shockwave, and the shockwave goes really far. It extends basically to the end of the screen. It's not very wide, but it's usually wide enough to kind of hit an entire pack. And you mostly want to try to hit enemies with the shockwave. However, if you're close enough, then you can get those double hits. You can get the Pulverize itself and the shockwave. So you generally, at least on bosses or in raids, you want to be close to them so that you can get those benefits. I did try the Pulverize size temper as well. It does not do anything for the shockwave itself, but again, it is already kind of large. You can actually do a combo as well with Pulverize size. So instead of Petrify duration, you can temper that. And this opens up another kind of like more sophisticated playstyle where you can use Nature's Fury, Nature's Reach, which actually got freshly buffed as well to 5% per point, pretty powerful passive now, and even double when you have SAC applied to the enemy. So you can get 10% damage per point here. And with pretty juicy Pulverize size temper, you can get to a point where you can stay at distant range basically to activate Nature's Reach, just outside of close range basically, hit them with your Pulverize, and then hit them with the shockwave as well and benefit from this. So this is an alternative way of playing this. Instead of going for the Petrify duration, I would probably still keep Petrify in the setup because it's a good skill, but it is kind of tough to do this because there's only like a very tiny gap basically, and you have to hit pretty much exactly at max range, even with a Pulverized size temper if you want to make that work. And I also didn't really have the points here unless I wanted to give up something like defensive posture for some damage reduction. So I kind of abandoned that idea, but it is technically the strongest way of playing this, I think. Now for your gear, you have a lot of uniques in the setup, so this doesn't leave you like a lot of room to actually put certain stats. Here we just try to stack a bunch of willpower, a bunch of life where we can. We try to get our spirit per second roll, like one of them, lots of move speed on the boots, so that we actually go fast and we don't crawl around. So in this setup here, for example, you can have 166% movement speed before any buffs. If you want to go faster, there are options here on the passive, which has Digity Grade Gate, and there's also heightened senses, so you could invest into those if you want to get a bit faster. You could even put movement speed maybe on your neck instead of the crit, or instead of the armor if you can manage to get to like 100% crit in some other way, or get to the armor cap in some other way. There's also, for example, Insatiable Fury that can give you armor that people ask me about, so why am I not just going with that, and this gives me all the armor I ever want. Well, the thing is, this is armor in werebear form. And whenever you, for example, press Poison Creeper, whenever you press Bloodhowl, whenever you press your Petrify, you are not in bear form. So it is actually not consistent enough, at least for hardcore standards. I do not want to do this. On softcore, if you still have an acceptable armor value of like, let's say 8k plus or so, maybe you couldn't get away with that. But on hardcore, that's definitely a nope. So this means that you want to cap your armor without that chest as well. And especially later, if you transition to Terrorist Might, you have to do that anyway because it doesn't have any armor. So in that case, a bit of armor here. And you see here those offensive tempers that we have are Earth Critical Strike Chance. It's actually a really cool temper because you can get to 100% crit chance with this. You have a lot of this extra crit chance that you can get on your ring, your amulet, your glove, your weapon. So you reach 100% pretty easily. You also have the Ravens giving you a bit of crit, for example. So that is really awesome. And you want to have one temper of damage to crowd controlled enemies. You see this here. You want to temper this up a little bit because we have one of the Paragon Notes. This is the Earth and Devastation. So for your Earth skills, and remember we transform our Pulverize into Earth. Same for the temper, for example. It all works together, and here you get this extra damage multiplier when you have at least one juicy crowd control damage roll. So you want to try to hit like 35% plus on this bonus. It goes up to 40. So having something like this here is totally acceptable. And of course for your glove, we have Pulverize ranks. You want to not forget those. Pulverize ranks, even when you have the Harlequin Crest already, or even when you have, for example, Insatiable Fury, that also gives you the Werebear ranks. You want to have those. It's like one of your most important stats. And then you can have also crit chance, you can have attack speed, you can also have willpower if you want to have bigger bonks instead. So this is an option for sure. Just go with more willpower, because you generally don't really stack all too much willpower on druids because of these uniques, and because you just have other slots taking up other stats. So having willpower is fine as well. And then this chance to make enemies vulnerable. So this kind of guarantees we have vulnerable almost all the time at least. And this gives us, first of all, the 20% base bonus. And you can also have stuff like Natural Disaster here, for example, where when we deal damage to vulnerable enemies, it is increased. That is also like when you're leveling up, for example, you might not really have any vulnerable trigger at all, then you don't need those points in here. Lastly, for the Paragons, this is what it looks like. So we have a nice 7-board setup here with 6 glyphs in total. So we have the Fang and Claw here. This is one where you could actually choose another glyph, which is Earth and Sky. So they both do the same primary effect, bonus to magic. They both need the same stats. So you can kind of like solve one or the other. This one is really good when you make enemies vulnerable all the time. So especially when you have these vulnerable rolls here, for example, and you maybe master them up a little bit. Or for example, if you play the Nature's Reach version that I explained earlier with the distant damage, because this Earth and Sky gives you this 10% damage bonus against crowd controlled all vulnerable enemies. And otherwise, I've been running Fang and Claw because I was playing the close range version, and you have this close damage bonus here. So that's kind of nice. Then we have here the Earth and Devastation board. There's Undaunted for extra damage reduction while fortified. We fortify very easily on this build just by attacking, basically. We have the Spirit Glyph here. This gives us extra damage with crits and the stacking buff as well, together with Survival Instinct. This is a pretty interesting note as well. This is also another reason why your damage is somewhat inconsistent sometimes, because when you fight low life enemies, then you deal more damage, so you get bigger bonks the lower the life are, and you can kind of like execute targets, especially bosses, pretty well with this. But for example, you don't get these big one-shots against a full life enemy. So something to keep in mind here, why you have like this wide swing in damage as well. Then we have Werebear Glyph here. This is just damage reduction and a bit of additive, so it's kind of nice. We pick up the Ancestral Guidance here. We spend Spirit all the time, so this should be basically permanently up. Very good passive note here. Then we have Hide and Malice, similar thing here. We want to poison enemies with our Poison Creeper. So you want to walk into packs, you get this bonus. Big bonks, pretty good. And then we have Constricting Channels board here. We put Outmatch. This is very good to take down bosses in particular. And we buff rare notes. You can get a lot of life here from the Courage node. It's very nice. And lastly, we have the Inner Beast board here with the Dominate glyph. So especially when you get back-to-back all powers, those are going to be buffed quite a lot. You get a bunch of all power damage. So I threw this in here. A few final notes here about the playstyle and the passive tree. So number one, we have Pack Leader. So that's something I didn't mention before. I mentioned the Poison Creeper. You want to cast that very often, and you can reset it with Pack Leader. Now on a single target, this won't reset too often, but you also won't really have to. But for packs, this is very nice. You walk into a pack, you press Poison Creeper, you bonk them, and more often than not, you just get the cooldown back, and you have it ready for the next pack. So keep an eye on that, and then you can use the Poison Creeper very often. Then we have Bloodhowl here. So if you feel like you are struggling with resources, especially early on when you have like a maybe kind of crappy setup, you don't have your resource generation tempered or something like that, you don't have the spirit per second, you can also just swap this Preserving Bloodhowl here to Innate Bloodhowl, get the spirit from the Bloodhowl sometimes. That's very nice. This just helps you out, so early on this might be an option. And also up here we have Wild Impulses. So if you feel like you're really struggling hard with resources, you can also remove those 4 points here and you put them somewhere else. So there's the Nature's Reach that I talked about. There's, for example, also Resonance here. There's Natural Disaster. There's Heightened Senses. So there are a few options here to put these points. And also, for example, when you don't have a Harlequin Crest, then you might have to spend a few points a little bit differently. So you see this here, for example, with Harlequin, you just get a Wolves by default. You can get a point back, for example. And there is also another point that I gained somewhere that is kind of like the same story here, because Harlequin Crest just gives you a bit more. So there are like some slight tweaks that I made here based on the Harlequin Crest. For example, we maxed out Natural Disaster from 2 points that I acquire here, because I think we took 1 from Ancestral Fortitude and 1 from the Wolves, for example. So depending on, for example, also how resistances look, maybe you don't have your resistances capped, you might want to take out a few points somewhere and put them in Ancestral Fortitude. Make sure you have your resistances capped at 70, or even more when you have Tyria's Might. So you can tweak that a little bit. Or maybe on the Paragons, there's also various points where you can get extra res. So here, for example, there are res nodes. There's the res nodes here that are even buffed, for example, from the glyph. So you can always fine tune this a little bit. And that concludes my Pulverize guide here. So I had a lot of fun trying this out and optimizing the setup. I also want to give a shout out to Boiler, one of our local Druid enthusiasts over at Maxroll, who has also been updating the Pulverize guide. So this might look a little bit different from mine, because I always like to do like my own little tweaks and versions of these builds. But if you go here to our Druid guides, this has received some overhaul. So now that Pulverize is actually really good again, we actually have it ranked in 8 here currently. You can go check out Boiler as well, who has been working on a lot of Druid stuff here for Maxroll, and who has also been starting to put out some of his guides on his YouTube and streaming on Twitch. So go check him out. He's a very nice Druid blaster. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed this video, and good luck with the Druid, and see you guys next time.